Hello, my name is Sylvie and I am a first year full-time PhD student, having started at Brighton in October 2025 on a Techne funded studentship. My research explores the presences of fairies in literary modernist novels alongside early fantasy film and photography, and will utilise the fairy as a tool for rethinking archival practice. I am interested not only in the barrier between real and unreal worlds, but also in the gateway that the fairy might open when thinking about the often hidden world of private feeling. My thesis statement is that the literary modernist fairy, influenced by the visuality of fairy tale film and photography, acts as an embodiment of shyness. When read as a cinematic projection, the literary fairy gives shape to quiet feeling, where the conventions of realism falter. Much existing criticism reduces works such as James Joyce's Ulysses and Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse to their concern with the everyday. Alternatively, I am drawn to fantastical presences in these canonical works as presences that don't exist outside of mundane life. Rather, the presences of the fairy embody the imaginative play that exists within daily life. That being said, I also discuss modernist fantasy novels, Lud in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees and Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. Both novels characterise feeling with language that I read as both cinematic and shy. I study the relationship of these novels to fantasy film and trick photography. Examples include early film pioneer Georges Méliès, who made many films depicting fairies, though his most famous work is the early science fiction film A Trip to the Moon. The infamous Cottingley fairies will be significant, photographs taken by young girls in Bradford that had half of Britain convinced for a moment that fairies were in fact real. I've included a silent adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream here, and a series of angel photographs by portrait photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. Cameron, though her work is from before my research period, will prove relevant in relation to Virginia Woolf, in part through her role in Woolf's family. Here I will read an excerpt from my Techne research profile, which ties in the themes of gender and queerness. Fictional creatures have long been deemed peripheral, mirrored in the dismissive rhetoric historically used to trivialise the creativity of women and queer people. This doctorate will validate the girlish, queer, and quiet, and bring this periphery into focus. But before we unpack that, I will take a moment to give you a sense of my background and who I am as a researcher and a creative. So my academic background is in English literature, though I have written on film within English-based degrees. I completed my undergraduate degree at the University of Exeter and my MPhil at the University of Cambridge. Early on in my undergraduate studies, I became interested in archival practice and the imaginative potential of categorised and preserved documents. Between my MPhil and PhD, I explored these interests further, training in archival cataloguing at the West Sussex Record Office. In addition to my research, I am a practising creative. Predominantly, I am published as a poet, my work often inspired by fairy tales, the creaturely, and photographic ephemera. Connected to my research, I wrote a monologue for theatre about a fairy changeling, which was recently adapted by the Savage Heart Theatre Company at Brighton's Regency Townhouse. In the way of book publication, I will have a pamphlet and full-length collection published by two wonderful poetry presses in 2026 and 2027, respectively. It is worth me saying, though, that while I write poetry, my critical research is concerned with the modernist novel rather than modernist poetry, and I will address this distinction later on. Now, back to fairies. I am interested in the fairy as an image through which we might re-envision archival practice. I think of fairies as ephemeral traces, as creatures that people have historically searched for evidence for, while also, like archival materials, proving historically enduring. One notable example of the search for fairy evidence is Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock stories, whose reputation was somewhat damaged by the fact that he believed that the Cottingley fairy photographs were real, and wrote a book arguing this. Archives can also give form to what might escape traditional accounts of history, and to the fleeting, what is there and then gone. I've included images from an adaptation of The Tempest, directed by Percy Stowe, in which a fairy-like Ariel vanishes from Prince Ferdinand via some early camera trickery. This idea of the ungraspable is something that I will apply to literary examples. In this moment from To the Lighthouse, the fairy stands for the emotional distance between Mrs. Ramsay and her daughter Cam, who was off like a bird, bullet or arrow, impelled by what desire, shot by whom, at what directed, who could say? It might be a vision, of a shell, of a wheelbarrow, of a fairy kingdom on the far side of the hedge. Here the fairy expresses the act of trying to hold on to someone on an emotional level and failing. It interests me that Woolf chooses cinematic terms to describe Cam. As Cam metaphorically flies across the garden, she is something both shot and directed. I am interested in the archive in both the metaphorical and practical sense. I've started working with collections at the Keep in Brighton, compiling references in Virginia Woolf's correspondence to shyness and silence, and with collections of magic lantern slides owned by Screen Archive South East, based at the university. Other collections I intend to visit include the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum in Exeter, the Sylvia Townsend Warner Archives in Dorchester, the Cottingley Archives in Leeds, plus the Méliès Museum in Paris. Archival collections speak to my conceptualisation of shyness. Archives are home to ephemeral, obscure, or seemingly trivial materials that might not at first jump out to a researcher. But through quiet attention, this ungraspable, shy quality of the archive reveals its emotionally charged potential. As referenced earlier, I address the fairy in a feminist and in a queer theoretical context, as creatures deemed marginal in literary criticism, and certainly in film criticism when compared with the volume of work that there is on the ghost in early film, in part because of their girly associations. Victorians are often credited as having popularised the archetype of the small, delicate fairy, promoting a sanitised image of girlhood, as opposed to the medieval fairy, for instance, much more closely aligned with sexual otherness. I discuss queerness partly as it relates to sexuality, as I will be discussing writers retrospectively viewed as queer, such as Woolf and Warner. But primarily I define queerness in the sense of something that exists at odds with its environment, and must carve out alternative ways of existing. One relevant context will be the historic use of the word fairy as a homophobic term, which can be traced back to the 1890s. Méliès, in a piece of autobiographical writing, wrote of the moment he discovered the stop-motion technique by mistake, when a film he was editing jumped, which, he notes, made a group of men on screen turn into women from the next scene. I am drawn to the queer potential of fantastical transformation, and read fairies in this moment in visual culture as queer in their status as spectral, peripheral creatures. Queer theory is rich with commentary on ephemera, including Munoz's essay Ephemera as Evidence and Cvetkovich's An Archive of Feelings, which both note the difficulties inherent in preserving queer emotional lives. but nonetheless turn to an imaginative hope around what a queer archive could be. With early film often defined by both its absences and presences, I will argue for a reading of fairies in this period as queer ephemera, deferred or suspended fragments of an archive, waiting to exist. Lastly, I will return to the subject of shyness. Modernist critics Becky Carver and Kirsty Martin write, in separate pieces of critical work, that literary modernists shyly recoil from public theatrics. I read the fairy as a shy presence. Throughout fairy tales, fairies are peripheral. Fairies hide and disappear. They are often depicted as translucent. But the modernist fairy is also distinctly theatrical. In this contradictory state of shy performance, the fairy acts as a playful expression of quiet affect. The imagery of the modernist fairy is also cinematic, full of suggestions of projection, monochromatic palettes, and speechlessness, keeping in mind we're addressing the silent era of cinema. Woolf wrote an essay that defines cinema as the medium for certain moments of emotion, rather than poetry or painting. Examples of this in modernist novels include the silent people of fairyland from Lud in the Mist, who the novel's inhabitants have feverish visions of, and who are described, paradoxically, as bright shadows. In Joyce's Ulysses, the protagonist Leopold Bloom has a vision of his son Rudy, who's dead in the book, and he hallucinates that his son returns as a fairy changeling against the dark wall. There's a reference to his son wearing glass shoes, which has immediate fairy tale resonance, and makes this fairy presence a striking image for expressing grief. Formatted in this section of Ulysses like a dramatic script, Rudy's presence is both pantomimic and startlingly quiet. Both Rudy and his father described as speechless, until at last Bloom calls out his son's name. Specifically, I am interested in the novel form, as opposed to poetry, because of the challenge that shyness poses to narrative form. A shy protagonist doesn't move a plot forward via speech or action. Poetry, I would argue, lends itself more easily to introspection, whereas in fiction, shyness makes way for formal disruption. In modernist novels, the image of the fairy projection emerges in disruptive moments of shy feeling, giving form to affect where narrative convention falters. By drawing on fairies, signifiers of the marginal or the unknown, creatures that fill the gaps in rationality, I will open the possibility for a rethinking of the modernist novel as not only concerned with everyday materiality, but with emotionally charged glimpses into another world.